All right, so let's revisit this slide where we talked about keys being converted to strings. You can attempt to use a number as a key or a Boolean as a key, but it will be turned into a string, even if it doesn't appear that way. So let's make another object. We'll call this one numbers, and it's going to convert a number like 100 into a word. So the value will be 100. And let's do one more here. Let's do 16, which gives us 16, the string. So to access any of those out, we saw that this does not work. Numbers.100 doesn't work. It says unexpected number. But we have a second syntax to access values out of an object, which looks like this. We use array brackets, and then we put a key inside those brackets. So if we tried that with numbers of 100, it does work, and that might surprise you if you trust me when I say that all keys are converted to strings. But what happens here is that 100 is also converted to a string, and then it's used to see if there's a matching key. So inside of the object, you can kind of think of it as looking like this, where we have 100 in quotes, and we have 16 in quotes. And then when I ask for numbers of 100, it's going to look for 100 in quotes because it turns it into a string, and it finds it, and it gives us 100. And we can verify that this works because if I do numbers of the string 100, we get the same result. So it turns this into a string. It's already a string, and we get 100. Okay, so why would you use square brackets aside from if you tried to store numbers as a key? Why else would you use square brackets? Well, sometimes you have property names that may not be valid JavaScript identifiers. Now, an identifier in JavaScript is like the name of a variable. Here's an invalid name of a variable. Let my cat equal something. That is not one identifier. JavaScript is going to give me a syntax error. I also can't do something like this. Let 76 trombones equals song. Invalid identifier. Well, it tells me invalid or unexpected token. I cannot have a variable name start with a number. But that doesn't mean we can't do that as a key in an object. What we could do, if we just give up on making this a cohesive object and we just want to put some random stuff in there, I could do this, 76 trombones as a key, and the value could be great song. Okay, I'll refresh. We'll look at numbers, and we do have 76 trombones in there. Of course, I can't access it with the dot notation. Ignoring the fact that it starts with a number, it also has a space. So JavaScript would get very confused if I tried to do this. It's going to look for numbers.76. Well, that's an error already. And then it's going to just try and find something called trombones, a variable called trombones. It doesn't work. But if I instead use the square bracket notation and do 76 space trombones, that works fine because the key has been stored as a string, even if it's an invalid identifier, which means I can't use the dot notation. I can pass it into the square brackets and it works just fine. So that's one reason you would use square brackets if you had something that syntactically was not valid to use a dot notation with. But here's another reason. Sometimes we want to use a dynamic value, like a variable, to access data from an object. So here's an example of that. I have a color palette object, which is mapping an English word like red to a color code, which in general are really hard to remember. So this would allow you to quickly say, what is the color code for blue? And you would get palette of blue gives you this, 30336B. How would you not remember that? So I've copied this over into my app.js file, and we can do what we've already seen. I can use the dot notation to get blue or yellow. I could also use the square brackets. So palette of, and then I cannot do this. I can't just type yellow inside those square brackets like this. If I tried this, it's going to look for a variable or something called yellow. It's sort of like if I just typed yellow right here. There is nothing yellow. There's a property called yellow in the palette, but I can't just type some identifier if it's not defined. So when we use square brackets, we would use quotes. So I could do palette, quote, blue, and that works. But the main reason I'm showing this to you here is that we can also use a variable. So if we had some variable, let's go with mystery color, and maybe this is coming from some user input. This is a website and there's a color and a user is selecting a color. And we're going to set mystery color to be one of those colors. Let's say they select yellow, but it could also be blue, it could be red. If I want to access the corresponding color code, I can use the square bracket notation to do palette of mystery color. I will need to refresh my page to get this to load since I saved it over here. If I do palette of mystery color with square brackets, it works because it's going to look for the value of mystery color, which evaluates to yellow, and then plugs that into palette. If I instead tried that with dot notation, it would not work at all because now it's looking for a property actually called mystery color, and there isn't one. We only have red, yellow, and blue. Those are the only keys, so this is not going to work. It doesn't throw an error, it just tells us undefined. Just like in an array, if you're trying to access something that does not exist in that array, if I try to do index of 99, we get undefined. If I try and access a property that is not in this object, undefined. Whether I use square brackets or dot notation, that does not exist, so I get undefined. So this is one of the main advantages of using the square bracket notation, is if you have a variable or some dynamic value that you need to use in order to retrieve information. So I could even do something like this. Not that you should, but I could do palette of red. Let's do BL plus UE. And it's going to evaluate this code. It will take the string blue plus U and turn it into blue, and then use that to retrieve the correct code. So my general rule of thumb is to try and use the dot notation whenever possible. It is shorter, it's nicer to look at in my opinion, but when it's not possible, whether it's because you have a key name that is not valid as a identifier, like the key name that we had earlier, which I can't even remember what it was, but it was 76 trombones. That's not valid. So we can't do that, so we have to use square brackets. Or the other big reason is when you want to use a variable or some dynamic value as your key, you have to use square brackets.